In the dim, dust-laden corners of American history, some photographs rest quietly until someone looks long enough to notice that they are anything but ordinary. Tonight we drift gently into one of those unsettling relics, perhaps one of the most disturbing images captured in the early 20th century. A simple family portrait from 1906. Or so it appears at first glance. Yet hidden within its soft sepia tones lies a detail so strange, so deeply out of place, that it has troubled researchers and quiet archivists for over a century. At first, you see only a mother and her infant posed tenderly in the stillness of a photography studio. But if you stay a moment longer, if you let your eyes settle into the shadowed folds and delicate fabrics, something else begins to emerge. Something that should not be there. Before we wander deeper into this old mystery, if these whispered tales of forgotten photographs already feel like home to you, feel free to leave a like. I'm also slowly crafting another channel, one filled with even more curious and haunting stories. You'll find it waiting in the description below. Now, take a breath. Let's step softly into the past. The photograph first resurfaced in 2019 during a quiet estate sale in Providence, Rhode Island. Margaret Chen, a collector of antique photographs, was sifting through a box of uncatalogued images, portraits worn thin by time, forgotten by the families who once cherished them. And then she found it. A formal studio portrait, the kind many families commissioned in the early 1900s. The image showed a woman seated in an ornate wooden chair. Her dark Victorian dress perfectly arranged, every button and fold exactly in place. Her expression was serene, frozen in that familiar stillness created by long exposure times. In her arms, she held what appeared to be a small infant wrapped in white christening clothes. Margaret almost set it aside. She had seen hundreds of similar portraits, solemn, stiff, composed with the quiet discipline early photography demanded. But some almost imperceptible dissonance made her look again. It was the position of the mother's hands. It was the strange weight of the shadows pooled in the infant's wrappings. She carried the photograph toward the nearest window. The soft afternoon sunlight streamed across the paper, revealing details lost in the dim interior of the estate house. And then Margaret's hand began to tremble. The photograph slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the hardwood floor like a tired leaf. "Are you all right?" asked Jessica, the estate coordinator who had been cataloging items nearby. Margaret could only point. Jessica picked up the photograph, glanced casually, then froze. Her face turned pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. What is that?" Together they stood in silence, staring at the small, unsettling truth emerging from the shadows. The mother was not holding only one child. Beside the infant, nestled in the crook of her other arm, half hidden by the folds of the white christening gown, was something else. Something that did not belong there. The more they looked, the less it resembled anything familiar and the more deeply disturbing it became. On the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, was a simple line. "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell and children, Providence Studio, March 1906. Children. Plural." Margaret bought the photograph for $5. She carried it home through the quiet evening streets of Providence, feeling a faint tremor of unease, like the sense of someone walking just behind you, though you know the path is empty. That night, She scanned the image and enlarged it, taking her time with each detail. The mother, Catherine Hartwell, looked to be in her late 20s or early 30s. Her hair was tightly pulled back in the style of the era. Her eyes stared straight into the lens, calm at first, almost peaceful. But as Margaret studied them longer, that peace began to feel false. Was it serenity or resignation? Or perhaps the practiced stillness of someone taught not to reveal what they knew? The infant in her right arm was swaddled in layers of delicate white lace. Only the face was visible, and even that was partly obscured by a soft shadow. Margaret adjusted the contrast, brightened the image gently, and watched the tiny features sharpen. Her stomach tightened. There was something wrong in the expression, something subtly, profoundly wrong. The eyes were too still. The infant skin had an odd, almost waxen sheen when Margaret enlarged the image, a surface that caught the light in a way that spoke of stillness rather than sleep. But it was the other shape cradled in Catherine's left arm, partly swallowed by the folds of that white christening gown, that refused any easy explanation. Once your mind traced its outline, it would not let go. Once you saw it, you could not unsee it. If you're enjoying this quiet unraveling of an old mystery, a like and a subscription will keep these whispered stories coming. It helps the channel more than you might imagine. Margaret did not sleep well that night. She spent the hours following her discovery, digging through everything she could find about Catherine Hartwell and Providence in 1906. Providence then was a city humming with industry and newcomers, a place where families marked their lives with formal studio portraits, small rituals meant to preserve memory. What memory, though, was this portrait meant to hold? What scene had been frozen in that studio? And why would any mother allow herself to be photographed like that? The more Margaret searched, the more the photograph seemed to press questions back at her. Her inquiries led her to the Providence Historical Society, its stacks of city records and brittle newspaper pages kept like quiet confidences. After 2 days of sifting, an archivist named David handed her a thin folder census entries, a marriage certificate, a scattering of local news clippings. Catherine Morrison, later Hartwell, was born in 1878 and had married Thomas Hartwell in 1902. Thomas worked as a foreman at Gorham Manufacturing, one of the city's larger factories. They lived on Broad Street in a working-class neighborhood of other factory families. The 1905 census listed Catherine Thomas and a daughter Mary, born in 1903. No other children were recorded, and yet the photograph's back read plainly, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell and children. Providence Studio, March 1906. Children, plural. A cold knot formed in Margaret's chest as she read on. A small notice in the Providence Journal, barely more than a line, caught her eye. In February 1906, an infant son of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartwell had died after a brief illness. The announcement gave no name. The service was said to be private. The date lay less than a month before the studio portrait. Margaret sat back slowly. Could the child in Catherine's arms be that same infant? In the early 1900s, post-mortem photography, capturing the deceased to keep a final likeness, was a common, if somber, practice. Families often posed a body to appear peaceful, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with clergy or relatives, and such images were often labeled as memorial portraits. This portrait, however, had been catalogued as a normal family photograph. Unless Margaret returned to the screen and peered again, unless it had been intentionally misfiled or hidden, she zoomed inward, studying the tiny features, the waxy skin, the absolute stillness in the dark fixed eyes, the unusual rigidity of the small body. Each adjustment of contrast revealed more of the same quiet wrongness. David appeared at her shoulder. "Find what you need," he asked. "I'm not sure," Margaret said. She turned the laptop so he could see. "Can you tell me about post-mortem photography? Here around that time?" He nodded thoughtful. It was common, especially with infants. A photograph might be the only image a family had of a child who died. Usually they were posed to look peaceful, laid out with hands folded or seated as if asleep. Sometimes families were photographed with the deceased as a way to remember them. "Does this look like one of those?" she asked, pointing. David leaned in, studying the image until his professional composure shifted into something closer to unease. "It could be," he said slowly, "the stiffness, the way the face doesn't carry natural focus." But he frowned and drew nearer. "What is that next to the baby?" "That's what I've been trying to figure out." They studied the photograph together. The second object sat in Catherine's left arm, wrapped in linens much like the infant. It echoed the baby's position, a mirror image in the opposite arm, and it seemed to be roughly the same size. Yet its shape was wrong, disturbingly wrong, suggesting neither child nor doll, nor anything the two of them could readily name. What would you make of something like that, tucked beneath a veil of lace and shadow? Could a grieving mother be posing with a memory too painful to speak aloud? Or had the photographer, the studio, or someone in the family set a different, darker scene that day, one hidden in plain sight for over a century? The proportions were wrong, subtly, disturbingly wrong. Its form bulged where an infant's form would taper, sloped where a child's shoulder should round. And the way the fabric draped across it suggested a shape that did not belong in human arms at all. "Have you found any other records about the Hartwell family?" Margaret asked quietly. David shook his head. "Nothing after 1906 in this folder. But I can search the deeper archives if you'd like." "Please," she said, and so over the next 3 days, David combed through boxes and ledgers while Margaret immersed herself further into the photograph's secrets. She contacted experts in historical photography, sharing the image and asking for their interpretations. The responses came quickly and unanimously. This was not normal. The composition, the mirrored objects in the mother's arms, the ambiguous shape beneath the gown, none of it matched the visual customs or mourning practices of the era. It was as though the photograph belonged to a category that shouldn't exist. One expert, Dr. Sarah Chen of Brown University, agreed to meet Margaret in person. She arrived with a set of specialized tools and examined the original photograph with a care that bordered on reverence. Margaret watched her lean over the magnifier, adjusting the light, studying the shadows locked beneath the surface. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The photographer clearly intended both objects to be seen. But there's also an effort to conceal them. Look at the arrangement of the cloth. See the folds here, almost as if what Margaret asked. Dr. Chen looked up, her expression troubled, as if the mother wanted something documented, but could not reveal it openly, as if she wanted the truth to be hidden, yet preserved. If you're watching this, and you feel the same chill that Margaret did, Leave a comment below. What do you think might have been wrapped in those folds? Margaret's next clue arrived from a very unlikely place. While discussing the photograph in an online forum devoted to historical mysteries, she received a private message from a user named Rhodes Archive. It contained only a single cryptic sentence. Check the Providence Studio Registry, March 1906. The photographer recorded something strange that day. Margaret immediately contacted David. "Do we have studio registries?" "We have some," he said. "Which studio?" "Providence Studio, March 1906. It took David an entire day to locate the ledger. Providence Studio, he discovered, had been a prominent business on Westminster Street run by photographer Albert Fletcher. Fletcher was meticulous, almost obsessively so, and his records had survived inked in careful handwriting. The entry for March 14, 1906 read, "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell Family Portrait. Special circumstances. Payment, 12 triple standard rate. Session conducted after hours. Private. Mrs. Hartwell most insistent on specific arrangement. Refused all reposing attempts. Exposure successful despite unusual nature of sitting. Negative retained per customer request for potential future prints." A slow pulse of dread moved through Margaret as she reread the lines. Triple the rate. After hours. Refused multiple attempts to adjust the pose. What was Catherine so determined to capture? What truth had she insisted on preserving? But one detail shone brighter than the rest. Negative retained per customer request. A negative. Meaning the original unaltered record might still exist somewhere. David Margaret asked carefully, "Do you know where negatives from Fletcher's studio might have ended up? If any survived, he said they would be in private collections. Or maybe with the Providence Preservation Society." Fletcher's studio closed in 1923. His inventory was sold off. But glass negatives were fragile. Most would have broken long ago. Still, Margaret refused to give up. For the next week, she followed every lead she could find. She called antique dealers, emailed preservationists, and contacted collectors specializing in early photography. And finally, someone called back. A retired photographer named Robert Mills had purchased a box of old glass negatives at an estate sale 15 years earlier. "You're welcome to look through them," he told her. "But I can't promise they're intact." His storage unit in Cranston smelled of dust and forgotten decades. Cameras and equipment filled the shelves like the relics of some ancient workshop. The box of glass negatives sat on a metal shelf, its cardboard edges fraying with age. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. One by one, she lifted the fragile plates to the light, spilling in from the open door. Most were portraits, ordinary families, stiff collars, quiet expressions, until the 23rd plate. There it was, the negative of the Hartwell portrait. And as Margaret stared at it, she realized that negatives reveal what prints often soften or obscure. Details shift, shadows sharpen, hidden shapes emerge. She asked Robert if he could create a fresh print. "I can," he said slowly. "But it'll take a few days. Haven't developed glass plates in years." 5 days later, he called her. His voice was unsteady. "You need to come see this." The fresh print from the original negative revealed details that had faded in the copy Margaret originally found. The resolution was sharper, the shadows deeper, and what appeared in the image made her blood run cold. The object in Catherine's left arm, previously obscured, was now unmistakable. It resembled an infant wrapped in christening cloth, but where the baby's face should have been, there was something else entirely. The fabric had been arranged to hide it, yet the outline showed a form no human child could possess. Its proportions were wrong, its structure impossible, and Catherine's expression, now clear in the high-resolution print, was no longer the serene calm Margaret first assumed. It was the hollow, shattered gaze of someone whose world had broken in a single moment. Her eyes did not meet the camera. They stared past it, fixed on some distant horror no one else could see. Robert stood beside her, pale and shaken. "What is that?" he whispered. What was she holding? Margaret had no answer. But she had a new lead. Scratched faintly on the back of the glass plate in the handwriting of photographer Albert Fletcher was a message never visible on the previous copy. "May God have mercy on this family. I should not have taken this photograph, but she begged me. She said it was the only way to show the truth." Margaret pressed deeper into the history of the Hartwell family. David, at the Historical Society, widened his search through hospital logs, police reports, and newspapers. What emerged was disturbing. In April 1906, just 1 month after the photograph, Catherine Hartwell was committed to Butler Hospital Providence's psychiatric institution. The admission notes stated severe melancholia. Claims to have witnessed impossible event. Insists she is caring for 2 children despite the death of her infant son in February. Catherine remained institutionalized for 3 years. Doctors described a woman grieving, yet strangely consistent in a story she never altered. One doctor wrote, "Patient seems aware her claims sound irrational, yet recounts them exactly the same each time." What claims? What story had she repeated for 3 years? A fire in 1954 destroyed most records from that era. Only scattered notes survived, none explaining what she believed she had witnessed. Thomas Hartwell remarried in 1909, moving to Boston with his new wife and daughter. Catherine, released that same year, vanished from the public record. No death certificate, no census entries, nothing. But Margaret uncovered one final piece. In a box of letters donated by a descendant of photographer Albert Fletcher, she found a letter dated May 1906. Fletcher wrote to his brother explaining he was leaving Providence because of a photograph he regretted taking. Catherine had brought 2 bundles, one containing her deceased infant son and the other something else. Something she insisted had been left in the crib the night her son supposedly died. Fletcher could not bring himself to describe what he saw under the cloth. He wrote, "I'm a man of science and reason, but what I uncovered was not of this natural world." Mrs. Hartwell was not mad. She sought to record evidence of something that should not exist. He moved to Portland, Maine weeks later and never spoke of Providence again. Now, in the quiet reading room of the Historical Society, Margaret pieced together what remained: a baby who died in February 1906. A photograph taken in March that Catherine paid triple price for insisting on a precise arrangement. A photographer so disturbed he fled the city. A mother institutionalized repeating a story, now lost to time. And a second infant in the portrait, something wrapped, shaped, and left behind, something no human being had the language to describe. The mother had spent 3 years in a psychiatric hospital, repeating the same story again and again. No one ever wrote down exactly what she claimed, and no one would describe what the second object in that photograph truly showed. But Margaret kept returning to the high-resolution scan of the new print, zooming in until the image grain seemed to breathe. The object in Catherine's left arm was wrapped in the same soft christening cloth as the infant in her right. Yet, the shape hidden beneath the fabric felt wrong. Wrong in ways Margaret struggled to articulate. The longer she looked, the more it seemed to shift. At one moment, it resembled a baby's face, small, rounded, infant-like. And then, as her eyes adjusted, the shapes rearranged themselves into something else entirely. Something that didn't fit within the boundaries of biology at all. Dr. Chen from Brown University examined the new print in silence before offering her thoughts. "This is either an elaborate hoax," she murmured, which seems unlikely, given the photographer's reaction, "or it is a genuine attempt to document something that the people involved believed was real and impossible." "Which do you believe?" Margaret asked softly. Dr. Chen stared at the photograph for a long, quiet moment. "I'm not sure," she whispered. Days later, Margaret received a private message from a user named Rhodes Archive. The message contained only a single cryptic line. "Check the Providence Studio Registry, March 1906. The photographer recorded something strange that day. Margaret immediately contacted David at the Historical Society. "Do we have studio registries?" she asked. "Some," he replied. "Which studio?" "Providence Studio. March 1906. It took David another full day to track it down. Providence Studio had once been a respected business on Westminster Street, operated by a meticulous man named Albert Fletcher. His ledgers miraculously had survived. The entry for March 14, 1906 read, "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell. Family portrait. Special circumstances. Payment 12 triple standard rate. Session conducted after hours. Private missives. Hartwell most insistent on specific arrangement. Refused all attempts to repose subjects. Exposure successful despite unusual nature of sitting. Negative retained on customer request for potential future prints." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Triple the normal price. After hours, a private session. An arrangement the mother refused to alter. What had Catherine been so desperate, so determined to document? But it was that final note that caught Margaret by the throat. Negative retained per customer request. David. She asked, where would negatives from this era even be now, if any survived? Private collectors, maybe the Providence Preservation Society. Fletcher's studio closed in 1923. Everything was auctioned off, but glass negatives break easily. Most were probably lost. Margaret spent the next week chasing lead after lead. Antique dealers, historical societies, private collectors. Finally, she found a retired photographer named Robert Mills who collected old photographic materials. "I bought a box of glass negatives at an estate sale 15 years ago, he told her. "Honestly, I never even looked through them. You're welcome to check, but I can't promise anything." His storage unit in Cranston was cluttered with equipment from every era. The box of negatives sat on a dust-covered shelf. Margaret carefully lifted each glass plate toward the light, and on the 23rd plate, she found it, the negative of Catherine Hartwell, holding two bundled shapes, one known and one unknown. Negatives often revealed details lost in printed photographs. Margaret asked Robert if he could develop a fresh print. "It'll take me a few days," he said. Haven't worked with glass plates in years. 5 days later, he called her. His voice trembled. You need to come see this. The fresh print revealed everything the earlier copy had blurred or obscured. The image was sharper, the contrast deeper. And what it showed made Margaret's blood run cold. The object in Catherine's left arm, now vivid and undeniable, was shaped like an infant wrapped for baptism. But where a baby's face should have been, there was only an outline of something shaped to mimic life. Something that had never been alive at all. The proportions were wrong. The structure was impossible. And Catherine's face, this time, there was no mistaking it. Not peace, not calm, but a blank, hollow stare. The expression of a woman who had seen something that shattered the world she understood. Her gaze was fixed not on the camera but past it, into a distance no one else could see. Robert stood beside her pale. What is that? He whispered. What was she holding? Margaret had no answer. But there was something else. On the back of the glass plate, faintly scratched into the surface in Fletcher's handwriting. May God have mercy on this family. I should not have taken this photograph, but she begged me. She said it was the only way to show the truth. Margaret knew she needed to understand what had happened to the Hartwell family. David widened his search city records, hospital logs, police reports, newspapers. The results were chilling. In April 1906, only 1 month after the photograph, Catherine Hartwell was committed to Butler Hospital Providence's psychiatric institution. The admission note read, severe melancholia. Claims to have witnessed impossible event. Husband reports patient inconsolable since death of infant son in February. Patient insists she is caring for both children. Despite explanation only, daughter remains living. Catherine remained there for 3 years. Doctors described grief, yes, but also something stranger. One entry read, patient maintains consistent story. Details unchanged across all interviews. No additional symptoms of delusion. Appears fully aware of how her claims sound, yet unable to recount anything different. What story? What event had she described over and over? Margaret requested Catherine's full medical file, but Butler Hospital informed her that nearly all documents from that era were destroyed in a 1954 fire. Only the stray notes copied into city records survived. Meanwhile, Catherine's husband Thomas remarried in 1909 and moved to Boston with his new wife and daughter. Catherine, released that same year, vanished from all public records. No death certificate, no census entries. She simply disappeared. But there was still one last clue. In a box of donated letters written by photographer Albert Fletcher, Margaret found a letter dated May 1906, just weeks after the photograph. In it, Fletcher confessed to his brother that he was leaving Providence forever because of what he had photographed. Catherine had brought 2 bundles, one containing her deceased infant son, and the other something she claimed had been left in his crib on the night he supposedly died. Fletcher wrote, I uncovered the second bundle to adjust it for the portrait. I cannot write what I saw. I have not slept for 3 nights. I am a man of science, yet there are things science cannot explain. Whatever was in that bundle was not of natural origin. Mrs. Hartwell was not mad. She was documenting evidence of something that should not exist. He left Providence weeks later opened a new studio in Maine, and never mentioned the Hartwell incident again. Now sitting in the dim reading room of the Historical Society, Margaret laid out all the pieces. A baby boy who died in February 1906. A mother who insisted on a private triple-rate portrait session a month later. 2 bundles in her arms, though only one living child existed. A photographer so horrified that he fled the city. A woman institutionalized for 3 years, unable to change her story. And an object in the photograph, shaped like an infant, yet impossibly wrong. The mother spent 3 quiet years within the walls of a psychiatric hospital, repeating the same story over and over again. No doctor, nurse, or relative ever said aloud what that story truly was, or what exactly the second object in the photograph revealed. Margaret leaned closer to the high-resolution scan of the newly recovered print. The object resting in Catherine's left arm wore the same christening cloth as the infant in her right, but the shape beneath the fabric felt wrong in a way Margaret couldn't name. It shifted the longer she stared. Sometimes it held the soft, round suggestion of a face, a tiny one. But then the contours would slip into something else, something that made no biological sense at all. Dr. Chen from Brown University examined the print carefully before offering her analysis. This is either an elaborate hoax, which seems unlikely, given the photographer's reaction and everything that followed, or it's a record of something the people involved believed was real and impossible. So which do you believe? Margaret asked. Dr. Chen studied the photograph for a long, steady moment. I'm a scientist. I should say it was a psychological break. But then she pointed to the object in Catherine's arm. Yet in 20 years of studying historical photography, I've never seen anything like this. The shape, the way the fabric drapes over it, the proportions. It's as if someone tried to fashion something infant-like without understanding the true form. Or as if something tried to mimic an infant and simply couldn't. A cold shiver crept along Margaret's spine. You think it's real? You think Catherine was holding something that shouldn't exist? I think Catherine believed she was, Dr. Chen whispered. And I think the photographer believed it too. Whatever happened in Providence in early 1906, it was disturbing enough, impossible enough, that those who tried to document it were silenced or dismissed as mad. She paused, her gaze lingering on the strange, swaddled shape. But the truth of what actually happened, I don't think we'll ever know. Margaret published her research under the title The Hartwell Photograph, a study in early 20th century trauma documentation or evidence of the unexplained. The academic world splintered immediately. Some dismissed it as a case study in grief-driven delusion. Others argued the evidence demanded deeper investigation. The debates grew heated, both in historical circles and among paranormal researchers. Hundreds of emails poured into Margaret's inbox, angry skeptics accusing her of fakery, passionate believers praising her for exposing what they considered undeniable proof of the supernatural. But most messages came from ordinary people who had simply looked at the photograph and felt something profoundly wrong stir within them. One message stood apart. It came from an 83-year-old woman named Eleanor Pritchard living in a quiet nursing home in Vermont. She claimed to be a distant relative of Catherine Hartwell, and she said her family had carried a secret for generations. Margaret drove to Vermont the following week. The nursing home sat peacefully above the blue surface of Lake Champlain, and Eleanor waited for her in a sunlit common room, a weathered leather journal resting on her lap. My grandmother told me about Catherine when I was a girl. Eleanor began, her voice soft and steady. The family never spoke of her openly. Too much shame in those days. But my grandmother, she believed Catherine, believed what exactly Margaret asked. Eleanor opened the journal. Inside were letters, pressed flowers, and old photographs. Catherine didn't die or vanish after leaving Butler Hospital. She came to live with my grandmother, changed her surname back to Morrison, and lived quietly, working as a seamstress, never remarrying. She died in 1947 at 69. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Did she ever talk about what happened? About the photograph? Not at first, Eleanor said. But in her final years, when cancer had weakened her, she told my grandmother everything. My grandmother recorded it all. She turned the fragile pages, revealing neat handwriting from 1946. Would you like to hear it? Margaret nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Eleanor began to read. Catherine said that in February 1906, her infant son James fell ill. A high fever, constant crying, restless through the nights. On the third night, she stayed by his crib, watching, exhausted. Around 3 a.m, she dozed off. When she woke, the silence felt wrong, too complete. She hoped it meant the fever had broken, that James was finally sleeping peacefully. But when she stepped to the crib and looked down, she knew instantly that something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The baby looked like James. Same size, same dark hair, the same familiar features. Yet, a mother always knows her child, and this infant's eyes were wrong. The color matched, yes, but the movement, the way they tracked across the room, felt subtly off, unsettling in a way Catherine could not explain. Even the sounds it made were close, but not quite right, like an imitation of a baby's cry, created by something that didn't fully understand how a human infant should sound. When Catherine lifted the child from the crib, her breath caught. The body was cold, not feverish, not recovering cold, and the weight was wrong, distributed strangely in her arms. She called for Thomas, desperate for him to see what she saw, but he noticed nothing unusual. To him, this was simply their son miraculously improved after days of illness. But Catherine knew. This was not James. She searched the house frantically through the night. In the cellar, in a shadowed corner, she found something wrapped in a blanket. Something small, something still, something shaped in a way that was meant to resemble an infant, but failed. When she pulled back the blanket, she saw. Eleanor paused, her hands trembling against the journal. My grandmother couldn't write down what Catherine described. She only wrote something that tried to look human, but failed. Margaret leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What did Catherine do? She brought it upstairs, Eleanor said softly. She tried to show Thomas, tried to make him understand that their real son was gone and something else had been left in his place. But Thomas refused. He insisted she was hysterical. He refused to look closely. And before she could stop him, he took the bundle and burned it in the fireplace. By morning, he had called the doctor. The baby, the replacement, was examined and declared healthy. No one would listen. No one would look long enough to notice what she saw immediately. So Catherine went to the photographer. She begged him to take a picture of both the living child and what she believed was proof of the impossible. She had salvaged pieces of the burned bundle, rewrapped and hidden, and brought them with her. The photographer tried to refuse until Catherine paid him triple his usual fee. She only needed someone, anyone, to see what she was seeing. When he unwrapped the bundle to position it, Eleanor said he finally understood. My grandmother wrote that the photographer confirmed the remains were not organic matter. Instead, they appeared to be a constructed form made of materials he could not recognize, designed to mimic infant anatomy, but never quite achieving it. After that sitting, Catherine's world collapsed. Thomas had her committed. The photograph was hidden away. And the child everyone believed was James grew up beside Mary, though Catherine never accepted him as her son. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the mystery, Eleanor said gently, leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps. Margaret sat frozen for a long moment. What happened to the child? The one everyone thought was James. Eleanor turned more pages. He died in 1911 at age 5. A sudden illness, almost identical to what James had suffered years earlier. Thomas and his new wife buried him quickly, private service. But according to Catherine, Thomas finally looked closely at the body before the burial. And in that moment, he saw what she had been trying to make him see for 5 years. He never spoke to Catherine again. The guilt hollowed him. He died in 1918, and Eleanor's grandmother believed shame had played its part. Mary, the daughter, lived until 1976. She rarely spoke about her childhood. But just once, she told her daughter that she remembered a little brother who wasn't quite right. A child who didn't understand how to play, how to speak, how to connect. A child whose stare made her deeply uncomfortable. When he died, she felt relief and spent her entire life feeling guilty for it. Margaret returned to Providence carrying copies of the journal. It explained the context, but it left the deeper question untouched. What had Catherine been holding in that photograph? In March 1906, Catherine had searched for answers. Folklorists mentioned changeling stories, ancient tales of supernatural beings replacing human infants. But weren't those just myths? Warnings, fairy tales? Anthropologists added that nearly every culture had versions of the story, suggesting either a shared psychological response to infant illness and death, or something far more unnerving, stories rooted in real but unexplained events, filtered through whatever language people had to make sense of the impossible. A pediatric psychiatrist offered another explanation, a known condition called Capgras delusion, in which profound grief or postpartum psychosis convinces a mother that her child has been replaced. Even though the person recognizes familiar features, they feel certain the loved one is an imposter. This delusion can be specific, persistent, unshakable. But in this case, it wasn't just Catherine. The photographer had seen it too. He had confirmed her observations. And that was what made Margaret pause, reluctant to accept a simple psychological explanation. 2 independent witnesses had reacted with the same horror to what they saw. Margaret reached out to the descendants of Albert Fletcher, the photographer. His grandson, now in his 80s, remembered the old family stories about that strange day in Providence, the event that drove his grandfather away from the city. My father told me that grandfather would sometimes wake in the night shouting about something he had photographed, something that shouldn't exist. The grandson told Margaret over the phone. He never explained what it was, but he always kept a note locked in his desk. After he passed, my father found it. It just said, "I photographed something that proves we don't understand the nature of reality." I wish I hadn't. In 2023, Margaret arranged for multiple scientific analyses of the photograph. A forensic imaging specialist examined every pixel with advanced technology, looking for any sign of manipulation, double exposure, or alteration. Dr. Chen from Brown University spoke softly, almost reverently. "I should say it was a psychological break. That is what science demands," she admitted. But then she pointed to the object in Catherine's left arm. "I've been studying historical photographs for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. The way it is shaped, the way the fabric drapes over it, the proportions. It's as if someone tried to create something that looked like an infant, but didn't quite understand the correct form. Or perhaps something tried to mimic an infant and failed." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She whispered, "You think it's real? You think Catherine was holding something that shouldn't exist?" Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "I think Catherine believed she was holding something impossible. I think the photographer believed it too. Something happened in Providence in early 1906 that was so disturbing, so impossible, that the only people who could document it were silenced or dismissed as mad." She paused, eyes distant. "But what actually happened? The truth? I don't think we'll ever know." Margaret published her findings in a paper titled "The Hartwell Photograph, Early 20th Century Trauma, or Evidence of the Unexplained." The academic world was divided. Some saw it as a fascinating case study of grief delusion and post-mortem photography. Others believed the evidence warranted further investigation. Her paper sparked heated debates across historical and paranormal research circles. Hundreds of emails arrived at Margaret's inbox, skeptics demanding confessions, believers offering gratitude for bringing attention to the unexplainable. Most emails, however, came from ordinary people who, after seeing the photograph, could not shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. One email stood out. It came from an 83-year-old woman named Elelana Pritchard, a distant cousin of Catherine Hartwell. Living in a nursing home in Vermont, she claimed to hold knowledge passed down through generations. Margaret drove there the following week. The nursing home overlooked the placid waters of Lake Champlain sunlight spilling into the common room, where Elelana waited, a worn leather journal resting on her lap. "My grandmother told me about Catherine when I was a girl," Elelana said, her voice soft but steady. The family never spoke of her openly. There was too much shame attached to mental illness back then. But my grandmother, she felt sorry for Catherine. She believed her. Believed. "What exactly?" Margaret asked, leaning in. Elelana opened the journal. Inside were handwritten letters, pressed flowers, and a few small photographs. Catherine didn't die or disappear after leaving Butler Hospital. She came to live with my grandmother here in Vermont. She changed her name back to Catherine Morrison, went by her maiden name. She lived quietly, worked as a seamstress, never married again. She died in 1947, aged 69. Margaret's heart raced. Did she ever speak about what happened? About the photograph? Not at first, Elelana continued. But in her final years, when she was dying of cancer, she told my grandmother everything. And my grandmother wrote it all down. She carefully turned the pages, revealing neat handwriting. Dated 1946. Would you like to hear it? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Elena began to read. In February 1906, Catherine's infant son James fell ill. High fever, restlessness, ceaseless crying. On the third night, Catherine sat vigil beside his crib. Around 3 a.m, she dozed in her chair. When she awoke, the room was utterly silent. The baby had stopped crying. Catherine approached the crib, relieved, thinking, perhaps the fever had broken, that her son was finally sleeping peacefully. But the instant she looked into the crib, she knew something was terribly wrong. The infant looked like James. Same size, same dark hair, same familiar features. But a mother knows her child. These eyes, they were wrong. The color was correct, but the way they moved, the way they tracked it was off. When it made sounds, they were close but not quite right. Like someone attempting to imitate a baby's cry without understanding it fully. Catherine lifted the infant from the crib. Cold. Not fever hot, like James had been. The weight felt wrong, unevenly distributed in her arms. She called for Thomas. To him it was just their son recovered from illness. But Catherine knew. She knew this wasn't James. Frantically, she searched the house that night. In the cellar, in a dark corner, she found something wrapped in a blanket. Small, still, wrong, yet shaped to resemble an infant. When she uncovered it, she saw. Elena paused, her hands trembling slightly. My grandmother couldn't write what Catherine saw. She could only describe something that tried to look human and failed. Margaret leaned forward. What did Catherine do? She brought it upstairs, showed it to Thomas, tried to make him see that their real son was gone, that something had been left in his place, but he refused. Told her she was hysterical, that James was fine. He took the bundle from her, burned it in the fireplace before she could stop him. The next day he called the doctor. The replacement baby was examined, declared healthy. No one would listen to Catherine. No one would look closely enough to see what she saw. So Catherine went to the photographer. She begged him to photograph both the living child and the evidence she believed was real. Pieces of the burned bundle, carefully rewrapped, were brought along. At first, the photographer refused. But Catherine paid triple the rate, insisting someone else needed to see what she was seeing. When he unwrapped the bundle to prepare the photograph, he understood. My grandmother wrote, Elena said the photographer confirmed to Catherine that what she had gathered from the fireplace was not organic matter. It appeared constructed, made from materials he could not identify, designed to mimic an infant, but failing to replicate it precisely. After that sitting, Catherine's life fell apart. Thomas had her committed. The photograph was locked away. The child everyone thought was James grew up as Mary's brother. Though Catherine knew he wasn't her son, Margaret sat in stunned silence. And what happened to the child? Elena turned more pages. He died in 1911, age 5. Sudden illness remarkably similar to what James had suffered in 1906. Thomas and his new wife buried him quickly privately. According to Catherine, Thomas finally looked closely at the body before burial and saw what she had been trying to tell him for 5 years. He never spoke to Catherine again. The guilt destroyed him. He died in 1918. My grandmother believed it was partly from the weight of knowing she had been right all along. Mary, their daughter, lived until 1976. She never spoke of her childhood except once to her own daughter. She recalled a little brother who was never quite right, who could not play or interact normally, who sometimes stared at people in ways that made them uneasy. When he died, she felt relief and guilt. Margaret returned to Providence with copies of Elena's grandmother's journal. It provided context for the photograph, but not the mystery. What exactly had Catherine Hartwell held that day? In March 1906, she consulted experts across fields. A folklorist noted similarities to changeling legends, stories of supernatural beings replacing children. Myths, yes, but widespread. An anthropologist remarked that nearly every culture has such tales, suggesting either a universal psychological phenomenon related to infant illness and death, or more disturbingly, that these stories might have arisen from encounters with the unexplained. A pediatric psychiatrist explained a phenomenon known as Capgras delusion. Mothers in severe postpartum psychosis or in grief-induced delusions can become convinced their child has been replaced. They recognize the features, yet insist the child is an imposter. It can be specific, persistent, unshakable. But in this case, two witnesses had independently confirmed the horror Catherine and the photographer. That was why Margaret could not accept a purely psychological explanation. She contacted descendants of Albert Fletcher. His grandson, now in his 80s, recalled the family stories, the incident in Providence that drove Fletcher away. My father told me grandfather would wake from nightmares, shouting about something he'd photographed. Something that shouldn't exist, he said. He never explained, but kept a note in his desk. After he died, my father found it. It said, "I photographed something that proves we don't understand the nature of reality. I wish I hadn't." In 2023, Margaret commissioned scientific analyses. Forensic imaging specialists examined every pixel-seeking manipulation, double exposure or alteration. The results? Inconclusive. If the photograph had been manipulated, it had been done with such skill that current technology could not detect it. But the specialist noted something new. "Look at the light reflections," she told Margaret, pointing at the screen. And for the first time, Margaret realized that even the smallest details in the image seemed unnatural. The infant in the right arm reflects the light exactly as it should. The soft highlights, the gentle shadows, everything matches the studio lamps Fletcher was known to use. But the object in the left arm, the light behaves differently there. Subtle, almost easy to overlook, yet undeniably wrong. The reflections bend unnaturally as though the material possesses optical properties no ordinary cotton fabric should have. A material scientist examined the high-resolution scans and agreed. Whatever that bundle was wrapped in it either wasn't cotton, or it was cotton altered by some unknown treatment that changed the way it interacted with light. And in 1906, there were very few chemical processes capable of producing such an effect. It was, in her words, anomalous. A reconstruction artist tried to model the underlying shape suggested by the folds in the photograph. After numerous attempts, she finally confessed to Margaret, "I can't make it work. The way the fabric hangs implies a form beneath it. But when I try to recreate a three-dimensional structure that would produce those exact folds and shadows, it results in something that can't exist. It's like trying to build an Escher staircase. It looks right in 2 dimensions, but it collapses the moment you try to place it in real space." These scientific findings only deepened the mystery. Either the photograph captured something genuinely impossible, or it was an elaborate hoax crafted with a level of precision and knowledge that simply didn't exist in 1906. Margaret continued her search, eventually tracking down Thomas Hartwell's great-granddaughter in Seattle. The woman, now in her 70s, knew only faint family whispers. The first wife who had gone mad, the family scandal no one spoke about. Her grandmother Mary Thomas and Catherine's daughter refused to recount anything concrete. All she ever said was, "Some things shouldn't be remembered. Some things should stay buried." But the great-granddaughter did share one chilling detail. "My grandmother had one recurring nightmare her whole life," she said quietly. She'd dream about a baby in a crib. She knew she needed to check on it, but she was terrified. And when she finally forced herself to look, the baby would turn its head. And she'd see it wasn't a baby at all, but something wearing a baby's face, like a mask. She would wake up screaming. That dream haunted her from childhood until the week she died. After Margaret published her paper, the photograph took on a life of its own online. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed it as proof of supernatural replacement evidence, of changeling folklore bleeding into reality. Skeptics insisted it was nothing more than a misunderstood post-mortem image or an elaborate old-fashioned trick. Neither side could prove their stance. The debate grew louder and stranger. People began reporting unusual experiences after looking at the photograph for too long. Emails poured in. A lingering sense of unease. Dreams featuring shrouded bundles or infants with wrong faces. A prickling feeling of being watched whenever the image was nearby. At first, Margaret dismissed it as suggestion. Expect something eerie, and your mind will oblige. But then she noticed the pattern. Many described details they couldn't possibly have known. The scent of old roses. Catherine's favorite perfume according to Elena's grandmother. The faint sound of a music box, the same one Thomas had gifted Catherine, still preserved in the Historical Society's archives. A sudden unnatural cold, the same chill that had always permeated the Hartwell cellar where Catherine discovered the first bundle. One sleep researcher, after examining the photo for Margaret, developed severe insomnia and begged her to remove the image from his workspace. "I'm a scientist," he insisted. "I don't believe in curses or haunted objects. But every time I close my eyes, I see that photograph. And I see things in it that weren't there when I looked at it directly. Shapes moving beneath the fabric. The mother's expression shifting. I can't explain it, and I won't study it anymore." And eventually, even Margaret was not spared. After months of poring over the image day after day, she began dreaming of Providence, 1906. Dreams so vivid, they felt like memory. She found herself standing inside Albert Fletcher's dim studio, watching Catherine Hartwell unwrap the bundle she carried in her left arm. Each time, just as the final layer of fabric fell away, Margaret jolted awake, heart-racing breath trembling, and always with the same overwhelming, terrible certainty. She had been seconds away from seeing something that would forever change her understanding of reality. The photograph remains in Margaret's possession, carefully stored in a climate-controlled archive within a locked room. From time to time, researchers, historians, and even paranormal investigators request to study it. each person who examines the image leaves with more questions than answers. Several have reported unsettling dreams and a lingering sense of unease long after they've seen it. Margaret has developed her own theory, though she admits it is guided more by intuition than hard evidence. She believes Catherine's infant son truly died in February 1906, but something else appeared afterward. Something that resembled the child enough to fool most, yet wrong in ways a mother could instantly recognize. Desperate for someone to witness what she had seen, Catherine commissioned the photograph. Confronted by something his rational mind could not comprehend, the photographer fled rather than fully acknowledge it. But what was in Catherine's arms? People always ask Margaret this. She answers honestly, she does not know. Perhaps it was a grief-induced delusion shared by two traumatized individuals. Perhaps it was evidence of something beyond our understanding. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. What is certain is that something happened in Providence in March 1906, something powerful enough to shatter lives and leave a documented mystery that still endures more than a century later. The photograph now hangs in Margaret's study behind glass. Sometimes, late at night, she swears she sees the wrapped object in Catherine's left arm shift slightly in her peripheral vision. But when she looks directly, the image remains as it always was, a sepia-toned woman holding two bundles, her face fixed in an expression of unspeakable knowledge, her secret preserved forever in the chemicals and silver of early photography. Margaret has stopped trying to solve the mystery definitively. Instead, she focuses on preserving every piece of documentation Catherine's story. Albert Fletcher's letter, medical records, scientific analyses. She has created a digital archive backed up in multiple locations, ensuring the evidence survives even if the original photograph deteriorates. Recently, a quantum physicist wrote to her intrigued by the image. He proposed that consciousness might interact with reality in ways science cannot yet measure, and that extreme grief or stress could heighten this perception. What if Catherine Hartwell and Albert Fletcher perceived something existing outside our normal senses? He asked. What if the photograph captured not only visible light, but another facet of reality entirely? It is like all theories about the Hartwell photograph, pure speculation. The truth remains locked in that frozen moment of 1906. The question of what Catherine Hartwell held in March 1906 remains unanswered. Perhaps it will never be solved. Perhaps some truths are meant to remain hidden, only glimpsed by those who experience them. Was it the tragic delusion of a grieving mother? Evidence of something impossible? A carefully constructed hoax or documentation of a reality we cannot comprehend? The photograph offers no answers. It simply shows what was there, leaving interpretation to viewers separated by time and understanding. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the mystery itself is the point, a reminder that despite all science and rational thought, corners of human experience still resist explanation. The image endures a mother, two bundles, and a truth too terrible or too impossible to fully grasp. Catherine Hartwell stares out from 1906, her eyes carrying knowledge she desperately tried to share, wrapped in layers of fabric and decades of silence. And somewhere in a dusty archive or forgotten attic, there may be other photographs like it, frozen moments of impossibility, waiting to be discovered, reminding us that reality may be far stranger than we dare imagine. If you've enjoyed this exploration, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and answer your questions. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to subscribe and turn on notifications. The results of the scientific analyses were inconclusive. If the photograph had been manipulated, it was done with such extraordinary skill that no current technology could detect it. Yet, the specialist noticed something peculiar that had escaped earlier notice. She pointed at the screen. The infant in the right arm reflected light, naturally highlights and shadows falling exactly as studio lighting in 1906 would produce. But the object in the left arm behaved differently. The reflections were subtly wrong, as if the material beneath the fabric had optical properties unlike ordinary cotton. A material scientist examined high-resolution scans and confirmed it. Either the wrapping wasn't cotton, or it had been chemically treated in a way that altered how it interacted with light. A treatment nearly impossible to achieve in 1906. A reconstruction artist attempted to model the shape beneath the fabric to match the folds and shadows visible in the photograph. After multiple attempts, she admitted defeat. It can't exist in 3 dimensions. It's like an Escher staircase, it works on a flat image, but cannot physically exist. Margaret interviewed descendants of the Hartwell family, eventually locating Thomas's great-granddaughter in Seattle. She was in her 70s, and though she had heard stories of her grandmother's first wife going mad, she knew few details. Her mother Mary had always refused to speak about 1906. Some things shouldn't be remembered, she said. Some things should stay buried. But she shared one chilling memory. Her grandmother had a recurring nightmare. Her entire adult life, a dream of a baby in a crib. In the dream, she would know she needed to check on it, but be terrified to look. When she finally did, the baby would turn its head, and she would see that it was not a baby at all, but something wearing a baby's face like a mask. She would wake screaming. After Margaret published her paper, the photograph became an online phenomenon. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed it as proof of supernatural replacement or changeling myths. Skeptics argued it was a misunderstood post-mortem photograph or an elaborate early 20th century hoax. No side could prove their case. Soon Margaret noticed another pattern. People who viewed the image reported strange experiences, persistent unease, vivid dreams of wrapped bundles or malformed infants, even sensations of being watched. Some described details they could not have known: the smell of old roses, the sound of a music box, the extreme cold of the cellar where Catherine had first found the bundle. Even scientists were affected. A sleep researcher studying the photograph developed severe insomnia and asked it to be removed from his lab. "I don't believe in curses," he told Margaret, "but I see things in this photograph when I close my eyes. Things I never noticed when looking at it directly." Margaret herself began having vivid dreams set in Providence, 1906. In them, she was in Albert Fletcher's studio, watching Catherine Hartwell unwrap the bundle, but always waking moments before the contents were revealed, heart-pounding, convinced she was on the verge of seeing something that would change her understanding of reality. The photograph remains in Margaret's possession, stored in a climate-controlled archive behind locked doors. Requests to study it come frequently, and each visitor leaves with more questions than answers. Margaret has formed her own theory. Perhaps Catherine's son truly died and something else, something eerily similar yet fundamentally wrong, took his place. The photograph was proof commissioned to show the impossible. The photographer confronted with it fled rather than acknowledge what he saw. What was in Catherine's arms, Margaret answers honestly she does not know. Perhaps it was a shared delusion born of grief. Perhaps it was evidence of something beyond comprehension. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. What is certain is that something occurred in Providence in March 1906, enough to shatter lives and leave a mystery that endures over a century later. Now the image hangs behind glass in Margaret's study. Sometimes, late at night, she swears the object in Catherine's left arm shifts slightly in her peripheral vision. But when she looks directly, everything is as it always was, a sepia-toned woman holding two bundles, her face frozen in an expression of unspeakable knowledge, her secret preserved in the silver and chemicals of early photography. Margaret no longer seeks definitive answers. Instead, she preserves every record: Catherine's story, Albert's letter, medical reports, scientific analyses. She has created a digital archive ensuring that the evidence survives even if the original photograph fades. A quantum physicist recently proposed that extreme grief or stress might allow consciousness to perceive aspects of reality otherwise invisible. Perhaps Catherine and Albert saw something that exists beyond ordinary perception, captured in light that we cannot measure. The truth, if it exists, remains locked in that frozen moment. What Catherine Hartwell held in 1906, tragic delusion, impossible entity or hoax, cannot be known. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain hidden, glimpsed only by those who experience them. And perhaps that is as it should be, a reminder that despite all our science and reason, there are corners of human experience that defy explanation. The photograph remains a mother, two bundles, and a secret too terrible or too impossible to comprehend. Somewhere in a dusty archive or forgotten attic, other moments like it may await discovery, challenging everything we think we know about reality. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.